Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello everyone, we are from the Puritan Age group. We'll presenting the result of our discussion. Before we start, I would like to introduce our group member. The first is me, Imtiyaz and Abdullah, and the other are Nabilla Nur Shahidah, Salsabila, Dhea Putry, Nasha, Fitria, and also Dhella Alvianda. I will be the one who narrated this presentation on behalf of my group. I hope you enjoy this presentation. Okay guys, we are going to the Puritan Age 1600 until 1660. Okay, the Puritan spirit. Puritan became known in the 17th centuries for a spirit of moral and religious earnest that informed their whole way of life, and they sought through courage reform to make their lifestyle the pattern for the whole nation. The metaphysical poet. The term was first used by Dr. Samuel Johnson, 1709 until 1786, a famous writer from 18th century. Metaphysical poetry prefers intellect rather than emotion, so there are a lot of scientific terms in the poem. There are plenty of prominent metaphysical poets in the first period like John Donne, 1572 until 1631, and then there are George Herbert, 1539 until 1633, and then we have Edmund Waller. It's from 1606 until 1678. There are Sir Johnson Stockling from 69 until 1642. There are Andre Marvell and Henry Vaughan. Andrew Marvell, it's from 1621 until 1678, and Henry Vaughan, it's from 1621 until 1695. Okay, for the picture you can see one by one. There are George Herbert, there are Andrew Marvell, there are Edmund Waller, Henry Vaughan, and Sir Johnson Stockling. So it seems like metaphysical poetry have a following characteristic. The first is the poems are always in short version, have solid meanings, and very economical in the use of words, or seem like concentration. And the second is the use of unusual imagination, or imaginary or unusual conceit. And the third, the use of harsh language and rude, of a very strong and raw language. Next is the use of science terms. It means science and learning. The last is the theme revolve around human nature, ambiguous, or man's dual nature, which means physical and spiritual. Okay, there are Samuel Johnson. On hearing Miss Trail deliberate about her hat, by Samuel Johnson. Wear a gown and wear a hat. Snatch your pleasure while they last. Hadst thou 9 life like a cat, soon those 9 life would be past. Okay, John Donne was born in 1572 in London, England. He is known as the founder of the metaphysical poet, a term created by Samuel Johnson, an 18th century English essayist, poet, and philosopher. They are the Cavalier poets. The poets of this kind of poetry are the most loyal followers of King Carlos I. They have high spirit, soul which are different with those metaphysical poets. They really love secularism thing and not really a fan of religious thing. They imitate a popular motto from Italy, Carpe Diem, which means catch the day. In our current motto, it's like you only live once, so be happy and do whatever you want to do. Make pleasure while you are still alive, because tomorrow you may be dead. Some prominent poets are like Robert Herrick from 1591 until 1674, with some of his work to the Virgin to make much of time to enjoy the time, and to daffodils, Thomas Carew from 1595 until 1639, and Richard Levelance from 1680 until 1678 with his poem To Aletta from Prison. The Cavalier poets were a group of writers from the 17th centuries in England. They are generally defined by their class and the fact that they originate from the which support Charles I during the English Civil War.
To Enjoy the Time by Robert Herrick. While fate permit us, let's be merry. Pass all we must the fatal ferry, and this our life 2 hours away, with the rotation of the day. To Dhea from Prison by Richard Lovelace. When love with unconfined wings hovers within my gates, and my divine Althea brings to whisper at the grates. When a light tangled in her hair and fettered to her eye, the gods that went on in the air know no such liberty. When flowing cups run swiftly round, with no allaying Thames, our careless heads with roses bound, our hearts with loyal flames. When thirsty grief in wine we steep, when health and drought go free, fishes that tipple in the deep know no such liberty. When, like committed linnets, I, with slither throat shall sing, the sweetness, mercy, majesty, and glories of my King, when I shall voice aloud how good He is, how great should be, and large winds that curl the fluid, no such liberty. Stone walls do not a prison make, nor iron bars a cage. Mine's innocent and quiet take that foreign hermitage. If I have freedom in my love, in my soul am free, angels alone that soar above enjoy such liberty.
The Puritan poet John Milton. The most prominent poet using this kind of poet style in Puritan period is John Milton. He served also as a foreign affairs at Oliver Cromwell's reign. He was raised in a strong Puritan, so that it made him to be a Renaissance, high-spirited and devoted to his faith. There were many factors which led to Milton's popularity during the 18th century. The first is, the 18th century was an age of classicism, and because Milton wrote his epic, elegy, and tragedy on the classical models, the classicists admired him and tried to imitate him. The second, his didacticism was in accord with the trends of the time. The third, the appeal of his poetry was primarily felt on account of the sublimity and fervor of his poetic imagination. The fourth, the undercurrent of Romanticism in the middle of the century found a strong ally in his poetry, and Milton became more and more acclaimed as champion of the inwardness and freedom of true poetry. The fifth, Milton's poetry style was imitated and admired by every writer of verse in the 18th century. He was a quarry of poetical praise for everybody. Sixth, finally, his versification supplied model to the poets who broke away from the classical tradition of the 18th century.
Paradise Lost of man's first disobedience, and the fruit of that forbidden tree, whose mortal task brought death into the world, and all our woe, with loss of Eden, till one greater man restore us and regain the blissful seat. Seeing heavenly muse that on the secret top of Ub or of Sinai didst inspire, that shepherd who first taught the chosen seed, in the beginning how the heavens and earth rose out of chaos.
John Milton was the greatest English poet after Shakespeare. Milton was a super poetic artist. His poetry is conspicuous for the following characteristics: lofty conception of poet's vocation. Milton has a noble conception of a poet's vocation. According to Milton, a poet's life should be a true poem. That is, a poet should live pure and chaste life. He writes, he who would not be frustrated of his hope to write well in laudable things of himself be a true poem. That is, a pattern and composition of the best and honorable thing. To him, poetry was a sacred vocation, and he always regarded his life as one dedicated to the purest and noblest ideals. He never lost sight of his life's mission. To Milton, poetry was not a mere intellectual exercise and diversion. It was something solemn, sacred, and sublime. Poetry comes only from divine inspiration, which is possible. Milton says, only through earnest prayer for God, who can enrich with all utterance and knowledge, and send out his seraphim with the hallowed fire and his altar, to touch and purify the lips of whom he pleases. This was Milton's ideal of poetry, and he pursued this ideal of through his life. Sublimity. Milton's poetry is sublime and majestic. It is the expression of a pure and noble mind, enriched and knowledge and disciplined by art. He lived a life of purity and austerity, and his poetry bears the unmistakable stamp of the nobility of his character. Whatever he was written has the dignity and stateliness of its own. His poetry has an elevating influence on the mind of the readers, and this influence is exercised not only by its lofty thought, but also by the grandeur of its style. Wordsworth wrote, "Thou hadst voice whose sound was like this." Love of beauty. Milton was possessed of a deep sense of beauty. He loved beauty in all its manifestation. He was attracted by the beauties of external nature. Allegro and Il Penseroso testify to his love of nature. Nowhere is Milton's love of beauty better displayed than in the early poems, Allegro, Il Penseroso, Comus, and Lycidas. The beauty of virtue always made an appeal of Milton's religious temperament, and it has found an artistic expression in Camus. Milton's love for the beauty of music finds expression both in Allegro and Il Penseroso. The song of the nightingale delighted him, and he found it most musical, most melancholy. In the book fourth of Paradise Lost, Milton has nicely described the beauty of Adam and Eve, in whose looks define the image of this maker's throne. Satan too is described as a magnificent figure, broad and powerful, dignified and majestic. Puritanism. There was, besides this love of beauty, a deep strain of Puritanism in Milton's poetry. In his early poems, there is a harmonious combination of the two strains. There is nothing distinctively Puritan about L'Allegro and Il Penseroso, but it is noticeable that love has not been mentioned as one of the sources of felicity of the happy man. Comus is really a hymn in praise of chastity and purify, and teaches us to restrain our passion and resist all temptations. In Lycidas, the Puritan in Milton is revealed in a violent outburst against the established church. His denunciation of the members of the Anglican Church, the Plymouths, is worthy of a thoroughgoing Puritan. In later poetry, the Puritan voice assumes a strident note. Milton becomes a stern Puritan during the later period of his life, and his religious zeal almost kills his humanism. The Puritan spirit represents spiritual discipline, moral austerity, otherworldly outlook, religious zeal, and moral earnestness. The religious tendency in the later poems is seen in the choice of the subjects, which are all taken from the Bible. The avowed aim of Paradise Lost is to justify the ways of God to man. Milton's epic was to be a Christian epic. Its theme of biblical and historically traceable to the Puritan elements in Milton. The subject of Paradise Regained resembles that of Camus. It portrays Christ's resistance of Satan's temptation and his victory over them. It has intense moral fervor, which characterizes Camus. The theme of Satan against chess is also biblical and is embedded with moral earnestness. Classicism. Closely involved with Milton's Puritanism, there is in his nature a strong bent of classicism, which is pagan and sensuous. He was a keen student of ancient classics and drank deep at the springs of classical learning. He wrote Latin prose as freely as he wrote English. His fondness of classicism is found in the first is his choice of classical and semi-classical form epic. The second, the dignity of his style built on classical models. The third, his fondness for classical allusions. The fourth, his elaborate descriptions and enormous similes in Paradise Lost. And the last, his choice of diction, which is abundantly classical. The next is John Bunyan. John Bunyan was an English writer and Puritan preacher, best remembered as the author of the Christian allegory, The Pilgrim's Progress, which also became an influential literary model. In addition to The Pilgrim's Progress, Bunyan wrote nearly 60 titles, many of them expanded sermons. He was born on 30 November 1628 in Elstow, Bedfordshire, England, and he died on 31st August 1688 in 859. He died in London of England. His occupation as writer and Puritan preacher. His genre of literary, Christian allegory, sermons, Socratic dialogue, and poetry. His notable works, The Pilgrim's Progress, The Life and Death of Mr. Batman, and The Holy War.
Of man by nature. From God he is a backslider, of ways he loved the wider. With wickedness a cider, more venom than a spider. In sin he is a considerer, a Macbeth and divider. Blind reason is his guider, the devil is his rider.
This is some literary works of poetry from metaphysical poets in this period. I think that's all from our group. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.